Hello, I'm Mackenzie, and I will be talking about Harriet Jacobs's life. My thesis is the book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl documents the horrors of slavery and the fight for self-determination and identity. Jacob's narrative does, however, also highlight the unique issues that female slaves encountered, namely sexual assault and the suffering experienced by slave mothers who are taken from their own children. But Harriet has shown that she is not a commoner by refusing to accept the shackles that were put on her and hurling them back at whoever she felt appropriate. She adopts the label slave girl in order to gain her own voice. Harriet Jacobs was born a slave in Edenton, North Carolina in 1813. She was the first African American woman known to have authored a slave narrative in the United States. She was an abolitionist and reformer, mostly known for her narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Harriet was the daughter of two slaves that were allowed to live together even though they had two different owners. Because they were light-skinned, they were referred to as mulattoes. Harriet's mother, Delilah, was the slave of John Harnablow, a tavern keeper, and her father was Daniel Jacobs, a skilled carpenter owned by Dr. Andrew Knox. During the 1800s, the status of a child born from slave parents was determined by a legal doctrine known as partus sequitur venturum, which stated that slave or free status was determined by the mother's standing. If the mother was enslaved, so too were the children. Harriet's father was able to make a lot of money in his trade. He was allowed to work under the conditions that he paid his owner part of his salary. His greatest wish was to purchase his children and give them freedom, but unfortunately he was never able to succeed that wish. Due to her parents' shielding and her loving family, she never fully understood that she was a slave until she was 6 years old. Then Harriet was brought into the home of Dr. and Mrs. James Norcom. After her mother passed away in 1819, there, through the years leading up to adulthood, Harriet was sexually assaulted by James and abused by his jealous wife. In her narrative, Jacobs changes the real names of the people in her life and describes Mrs. Flint, otherwise known as Mrs. Norcom, saying that her and her husband constantly fought over his sexual advances on young Harriet. Once she finally confronted Harriet and received the answers she was looking for, she began to torment and watch over her while she slept, leaving Harriet fearful of her life. To prevent her victimization by Norcom, Jacobs sought out a relationship with another white attorney, Samuel Chadwell Sawyer, with whom she had two children named Joseph, born in 1829, and Louisa Matilda, born in 1833. They were married for a brief time, then unmarried soon after. When Norcom sent her to a country plantation in 1835, she managed to escape back to Edenton, where she hid for 7 more years, living in her grandmother's attic crawl space. During those 7 years, Jacobs could do little more than sit up in the cramped space. Her grandmother had been emancipated a few years earlier than this. While Jacobs was in hiding, Sawyer purchased but did not emancipate her children. Jacobs was finally able to make her way to New York City by boat in 1842 and was eventually reunited with her children there. Even in New York, however, Jacobs was at the mercy of the fugitive slave law, which meant that wherever Jacobs lived in the United States, she could be reclaimed by the Norcoms and returned to slavery at any time. The Fugitive Slave Law passed on September 18, 1850 by Congress. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was part of the Compromise of 1850. The act required that slaves be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. For most of 1849, Jacobs worked for the Anti-Slavery Office in Rochester, New York. It was run by her younger brother, who had also escaped slavery. She read through many anti-slavery writings and met many other abolitionists, many of them including white women. Jacobs wanted to capture her story as a slave girl, to catch the attention of Northern white women abolitionists, to show them how slavery dehumanized women by subjecting them to white men's sexual behavior and depriving them of the rights of their family. For the next 2 decades, Jacobs worked with the family of Nathaniel Parker Willis, a successful writer and editor. She took care of his children and grew close with his wife, Cornelia Grinnell Willis. Around 1852, her employer and wife of Nathaniel purchased her freedom from the Norcoms. Cornelia Grinnell Willis lived from 1825 to 1904. She was an abolitionist, women's rights activist, and creator of a women's club. It was in her home that Harriet wrote the historically significant incidents in the life of a slave girl in secret. Throughout her life, Cornelia worked to advance women's equality and their access to an education. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was edited and published in 1861 by Lydia Maria Child. Jacobs used the pseudonym Linda Brent and changed all of the names in the book to protect the identity and safety of her family. The book documents Jacobs' life as a slave and how she gained freedom for herself and for her children. In the fall of 1833, Jacobs gave birth to her second child, Louisa, or Ellen, in the book. When they told me my newborn babe was a girl, my heart was heavier than it had been before. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Superadded to the burden common to all, they have wrongs and sufferings and mortifications peculiarly their own. Jacob's narrative discusses that no matter the gender, slavery was a ruthless experience. However, she illustrates how women had the additional agony of having their children taken away from them in addition to the brutalities that enslaved men experienced. Enslaved women were frequently used as breeders, forced to bear children in order to increase their master's stock, but were denied the right to care for them. Slave owners commonly fulfilled their lust for their female slaves by forcing them to bear their children. Writing as Linda Brent, Jacobs detailed the sexual abuse of enslaved women and the anguish felt by enslaved mothers, while simultaneously showing that she is more than just a slave girl.